Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. We are seeing the ceasefire that did come as quite a shock remain between Israel and Iran after 3 days. However, in the last few weeks, we have seen some dramatic changes in the conflict between Israel and Iran. These changes make it highly likely that in the future, we will likely see this conflict spark once again. The Israelis see Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons as an existential issue. After the Israeli and American attacks, Iran should surely see that they may have no choice but to pursue a nuclear weapon to act as a form of deterrent against attack. So, are Israel and Iran locked in a trap in which they are inevitably destined to scrap once again? What are the Israelis' wider plans now that this current iteration of the conflict between themselves and the Iranians has paused? And how will Iran's nuclear industry look as we move forward? So, in light of the US attack that we saw occur on last Sunday, despite seemingly being an escalation, this was a batch of geopolitical theatre, and we de-escalated into the environment that we find ourselves in today. However, if we assess the characteristics of this truce, it is quite fragile and it still remains tense in the Middle East. So, there are still many scenarios that we need to assess as we move forward. What has truly changed as a result of this conflict? And how does the United States fall into this picture, especially if Israel and Iran are once again destined to clash in the future? So before diving into some scenarios, let's explore how the ceasefire came about. It's worth noting that right up until the time of the ceasefire, Israel and Iran were still launching strikes at each other. This ceasefire was brokered by the United States and Qatar at 10 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time on Monday, the 23rd of June. Just after 5 in the morning, GMT, on Tuesday, Trump said that the ceasefire was in effect. And at 6 a.m. on the Tuesday, Israel said it had agreed to the ceasefire. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. 2 hours later, the Israel Defense Forces said that Iran had broken the ceasefire by firing missiles at Israel. Iran denied this, and in response, Israel then hit a radar array near Tehran. We saw Trump get angry at this. He dropped an F-bomb on live TV, and he also released many posts on his social media platform, Truth Social. And these strategies combined seemingly did the trick, and the fragile ceasefire has held for the last few days since this occurred. We've now seen multiple events unfold over the last few days that indicate that this chapter of the conflict is over for now. Firstly, Iranian airspace has been reopened, which indicates that the Iranians expect this ceasefire to hold at least for now. Israel reopened the Leviathan gas field, which they closed as a part of this recent conflict between themselves and Iran, which indicates that they also expect the ceasefire to hold for now. In the aftermath of this ceasefire, we've seen the Israelis, the Iranians, and Trump all attempt to paint this as a victory for themselves. But one of the biggest questions that still sits in my mind is, as a result of this conflict over the last few weeks, what has truly changed? The biggest question, as I discussed last episode, is where is Iran's enriched uranium? Most reports state that this is 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, and based on this recent conflict and the secrecy surrounding the status of this enriched uranium, it's unlikely that it's going to show up anytime soon. The Iranians have also previously stated that they have a new nuclear enrichment facility that the International Atomic Energy Agency was potentially going to see before the Israelis launched this attack against Iran. There is the potential that this enriched uranium has already been moved to this unknown facility, but as I'll discuss later on, the Iranians are currently making their nuclear industry more secretive, not more open. So the likelihood of it being discovered where this facility is has shrunk. Secondly, these attacks impacted Iran's nuclear industry, of course. We can see that via surface level damage. But how much impact and damage was done? The New York Times has stated that Iran's nuclear program was only set back by a few months, and that the US bombs didn't collapse the underground nuclear facilities, namely Fordo. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has stated that these centrifuges at Fordo are no longer operational, and that damage to these facilities is serious. So we are receiving conflicting reports here. As I said on Monday, nobody can assess the true extent of the damage done to these facilities until people get inside them. So the best that we can do for now is to look for signs that the Iranian nuclear industry is being repaired and is once again heading towards an operational status. In the coming weeks and months, we can keep an eye out for satellite imagery around the nuclear sites, specifically Natanz, Isfahan and Fordo. And we can see if the Iranians are working to dig out these facilities or if they are potentially attempting to repair power to them. In fact, on June 24th, we already saw some movement at the Natanz facility on satellite images. Another development that we've seen in Iran's nuclear industry is on June 26th, we saw the Iranian parliament pass a vote to stop cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is worth noting that the Iranian parliament also passed a vote to block the Strait of Hormuz during the conflict with Israel and the United States. But, of course, they didn't commit to this because this would also hurt their own exports coming out of the Persian Gulf. In response to Iran's parliamentary vote, the International Atomic Energy Agency has stated that they haven't received an official notification from the Iranians. But according to the Iranian parliamentary speaker, the International Atomic Energy Agency have been informed of Iran's suspension of cooperation. More on this front will likely be revealed in the coming days when the vote reaches Iran's Council of Guardians, but I believe it could go two ways. There is the potential that this parliamentary vote is as symbolic as the Strait of Hormuz vote was, but if this isn't the case, a suspension of cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency would support Iranian rhetoric that they plan to immediately address the damage to their nuclear industry and to once again begin nuclear operations. So, to bring it back to the question that we started this section with, what has truly changed? I believe not much has changed, but the things that have changed are very notable. Firstly, Iran seems more likely than ever to expand its nuclear ambitions. The second change is that both sides are now weakened and need a pause. But, most importantly, the underlying reasons why both the Israelis and the Iranians continue to fight with each other still remain. As I discussed earlier, both the Israelis and the Iranians are claiming victory here. Netanyahu still remains in power, having survived a vote of no confidence, and he succeeded in dragging the United States into a direct conflict with Iran. Netanyahu wasn't going to end the war himself, because in order to maintain his coalition, he needs a war of some kind. Netanyahu has a very slim majority in the Israeli parliament, and so he essentially has to appease the far-right parties in his coalition, and they typically want war with Iran and want to hold a harder stance against the Palestinians, especially in Gaza. So Netanyahu wasn't incentivized personally to end this war with Iran. Also because if there is no war, then Netanyahu would likely have to face his corruption trial that he's currently putting off based on the, quote, security risks to Israel in the Middle East. But even though Netanyahu wasn't incentivized to end this war, Trump entered the war and we saw the batch of geopolitical theatre begin. So it was Trump who pursued the end of this recent chapter of conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians. The Iranians are claiming victory, stating that Israel was on the verge of collapse as a result of the war. And since the ceasefire, we've seen residents gathered in the streets in Tehran in support of the military. And public events have been organised, such as a concert by the Tehran Symphony Orchestra. Finally, Trump is also claiming victory. He has said that Iranian nuclear facilities were, quote, obliterated. But a leaked report we've seen in the last few days has stated that they were only set back by a maximum of a few months. Yesterday, on the 26th of June, we saw Trump scrambling to attempt to change this narrative. He sent his administration out to reinforce how much damage had been done to these Iranian facilities, and the Israelis have also followed suit by stating how much damage was done to the facilities in Iran. Trump also had the Pentagon host a press conference providing more details behind the attack on Iran, and Trump was posting frequently on Truth Social, where he specifically stated that the pilots were sad because nobody believed that they had caused the severe damage that everybody's saying that they had. Trump also attempted to answer one of the biggest questions that we saw in this recent batch of geopolitical theatre, and that was regarding the trucks that were seen outside of the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility a few days before the US attack. Trump stated that these were concrete workers who were attempting to protect the facility. However, none of this matters if Iran emptied Fordo months ago, which the Iranians have previously stated. So, everyone is attempting to paint this as a victory for themselves. But in reality, we are now in a dramatically worse situation than we were before Israel launched its attacks on June 13th. As I discussed last episode, by launching this attack, the Israelis and the Americans could well have convinced Iran to do the one thing that they didn't want them to do, and that's rush towards a nuclear weapon. So, as a result of these recent events, the likelihood of some scenarios has dramatically shifted. Some have become a lot more likely, some have become a lot less likely. In exploring potential scenarios for the future, I'm first going to start by discussing Iran's nuclear industry. In exploring future scenarios for Iran's nuclear industry, I believe there are two potential scenarios that we could see unfold. Firstly, we could see a situation where Iran's nuclear industry is limited once again, specifically in its enrichment. This would likely come in the form of a nuclear deal. Alternatively, we could see Iran's enrichment not limited at all, and we could see them continue to increase uranium enrichment, and to expand their nuclear capabilities, potentially towards the 90% enrichment level that is required to weaponize. So I will start by discussing the potential return to a nuclear deal. This is one such scenario that I believe is now a lot more unlikely than it was before the Israeli attack against Iran in the middle of June. But there are some nuances to note here. We have seen talks resume between the United States and Iran one day after the ceasefire, according to Steve Witkoff. Also, the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has said that Iran was, quote, ready to resolve issues at the negotiating table. We have also even seen reports that Trump is considering supporting Iran's nuclear industry to help them expand their nuclear power capabilities for peaceful purposes, which would massively help to address Iran's current energy crisis. But despite this seemingly positive news, I believe this still remains unlikely. Trump wanted zero domestic enrichment in Iran, even prior to this conflict. But the Iranians will refuse this because they need to ensure that they have access to a uranium supply in case Trump pulls out of any deal, or if heavy sanctions are imposed upon Iran and they could be restricted from trading such uranium. In summary, Iran is incentivized to protect its own uranium supply because external forces, if they could control it, likely could weaponize us against Iran. So Iran will want to possess a domestic supply of enriched uranium, the percentage of which could be negotiated, as did occur in the previous deal that we had, the JCPOA. This was restricted to 3.67%, but if a deal is to advance here, Trump will have to change from his stance of zero domestic enrichment in Iran. To bring it back to the JCPOA, we did have a deal, and it was Trump that pulled out of the deal, hoping to get a better deal. We could now see a return to a similar deal, but I don't believe this is likely. We are now in a different geopolitical environment completely, where Iran has spent the last few years advancing its nuclear capabilities and breaking agreements as a part of the JCPOA. Despite Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the UK, France and Germany still remain in the deal. It was, as I stated, when the US pulled out that Iran started violating the terms of the deal, which Iran states is due to a lack of sanctions relief from the signatories of the deal. There is one of the nuances that I mentioned to note here, however. As a part of the JCPOA, the signatories had the option to activate the snapback mechanism. If this is activated, it could see UN sanctions thrown at Iran, which involves a ban on all 193 UN member states from trading with Iran. If a country decides to still trade with Iran after this, secondary sanctions are triggered against them. The snapback mechanism also involves resorting to financial measures such as freezing assets. Of course, if such a mechanism was activated, this would be incredibly damaging to Iran, who are already experiencing economic and energy crises. But with tensions currently heightened around Iran's nuclear industry, and with the potential that Iran once again attempts to expand its nuclear ambitions, we could see the snapback mechanism mentioned a lot more frequently over the next few months as a potential tool that could be used. But the JCPOA expires in October 2025, which is a few months away. So any nation involved has until then to activate the snapback mechanism. Even though he had withdrawn from the JCPOA, Trump actually tried to activate the snapback mechanism during his first term, but this was wholeheartedly rejected by the other signatories. This event in history likely shows that any activation of the mechanism today would require the backing of the UK, France, and Germany. This is one scenario to look out for, but if the snapback mechanism was imposed, then this scenario of potential nuclear talks between Iran and the United States would be confirmed as dead. In the aftermath of a scenario where the snapback mechanism was imposed, Iran has promised that it would withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If this occurred, this would be confirmation that Iran would be attempting to accelerate its nuclear ambitions. And even without the snapback mechanism being imposed, we could still see Iran withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. All of these are issues that would contribute to this scenario of a nuclear deal being incredibly unlikely. There are also more reasons that I believe that a nuclear deal will be unlikely, especially now in the aftermath of this conflict. The Iranians seemingly don't trust diplomacy anymore. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, confirmed as such when he tweeted stating that Israel derailed the talks with the US when its attack started this war on June 13th. And we then also saw the US derail Iran's talks with the European Union when they attacked the nuclear facilities on Sunday. As a result of this, the Iranians are likely to be untrusting of any future attempts at diplomacy because these previous two attempts have been thwarted. Also, as I stated in the introduction, the biggest issue here remains nuclear enrichment. If something changes on this front, a deal could be more likely, but if that doesn't occur, I don't see a deal happening. Also, on the topic of potential US involvement in Iran in supporting its peaceful nuclear industry, I can't see how the Iranians would want an American influence within Iran, especially when the potential for the US and Israel wanting to pursue regime change within Iran has been discussed as a part of this recent conflict. The only reason that I could see a deal being pursued here in the nuclear realm is if the Iranians are playing a game, or if it will temporarily place them in an advantageous position, such as through maintaining the Iranian regime, or to give them more time to recover from this conflict that's just occurred for a potential future conflict. But after this conflict that we've just seen, especially in the near future, I see successful diplomacy as being incredibly unlikely. But if we are still in an environment of geopolitical theatre, perhaps a deal could be reached. I'll discuss this more later on in this episode. Also, on the slim chance that a legitimate deal did occur, I would expect heavy Russian involvement, either in mediating an agreement or when it comes to managing the differences between the United States and Iran on enriched uranium. However, I believe the second scenario in exploring potential futures for Iran's nuclear industry is more likely, and that is that Iran pursues nuclear weapons in secret. Based on recent events, this scenario, in my opinion, has become more likely. This scenario could see Iran potentially follow the North Korean path, and since we know that North Korea has nuclear weapons, has Trump been pondering attacking North Korea? I would assume that he hasn't, and this alone would likely be enough to incentivize the Iranians to pursue such a weapon, because it would protect them and it would act as a form of deterrence against any future attack from the Americans and the Israelis. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, since the end of the war, has said, quote, "We've taken necessary measures and are assessing the damaged areas. Plans for revival of the nuclear facilities were pre-arranged, and our current strategy ensures no disruption to production and services." End quote. So, Iran clearly plans to march on with its nuclear industry, and this is supported by the likelihood that their enriched uranium has been moved somewhere else prior to the attack at Fordo. The elite report, as we saw in the United States over the last few days, has stated that Iran's nuclear program is, quote, "mostly intact," and this ensures that Iranian nuclear pursuits could very soon be visible, especially on satellite footage around Fordo, just as we've seen at Natanz in the last few days. From here, if Iran did attempt to restart its nuclear ambitions, we could also see a withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which this would be a sure sign that Iran will be pursuing this scenario, and it would also be a sure sign that any potential nuclear deal will be dead. So, in exploring the scenarios for the future of Iran's nuclear industry, the snapback mechanism and a potential withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty are two of the biggest points to keep an eye out for. From there, if we saw Iran once again expand its nuclear ambitions, the war could very easily restart. But there is a worry here, and that's the underground facilities. It has been reported that the United States possesses 20 bunker buster bombs in its entire arsenal, and they just used 14 in Iran, when they used 12 on Fordo and 2 on Natanz. So if there is a conflict that occurs in the future, the United States had better hope that they can get the job done with the remaining 6 bunker buster bombs, or they need to start producing quickly. Now, it is worth noting, as a part of this scenario, there is a lot more to building a nuclear weapon than just enriched uranium. The Iranians would likely need to do a test, which will be detected, especially by seismic measurement devices. They would also need launch capabilities, but the Israelis and the Americans likely wouldn't get to this point at all, and another chapter of this war would likely break out. It's also worth noting that if this scenario did occur, how the rest of the Middle East would respond. Despite the China-brokered peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Saudis would almost certainly respond, and they are rich enough to be able to buy a nuclear weapon. Other rich nations in the Middle East could also buy one, but the most important point to note here is not the specifics. The most important point is that this could spark a mass nuclear proliferation risk in the Middle East. So these are the two directions that I believe we could see Iran's nuclear industry heading. But outside of this, there is also the wider issue of the war between Israel and Iran in general. As I've stated already, I believe that this is merely a pause. With this in mind, what potential scenarios could we see unfold from here? In exploring potential future scenarios in the general war between the Iranians and the Israelis, a high likelihood scenario that I can see unfolding, because we are already seeing it unfolding, is that we experience a temporary pause. First of all, Iran will want to address its glaring lack of air defense capabilities, which apparently saw Israel control the skies around Tehran, despite any actual evidence that this occurred. Trump has also stated that China can trade crude oil with Iran again, because we saw Iran's exports collapse overnight during the conflict. With Iran's energy sector being one of its largest assets, If its economic woes were to subside, selling crude oil would likely play a key role in this. With this temporary pause, the Iranians will attempt to allow their export capacity to recover and reach the levels that it was at before the conflict. As for Iran's energy crisis, they need baseload power to combat the blackouts that occur throughout the country. This is why Russia has offered to help support Iran in building 8 nuclear power plants. But this takes time. Despite the fact it takes time, however, this is a clear indication that the Iranians are making some efforts to attempt to address the issues with its energy sector. The biggest way that Iran could ease its economic and energy woes would be through reduced sanctions that would come with a deal. However, as I've already discussed, I see this as unlikely, which, in my opinion, means reduced sanctions are also unlikely. There is, however, the nuance to note here that this could all still be geopolitical theatre, and if so, then reduced sanctions could be a part of a larger formulated deal, but I'll discuss that in a few minutes. On the topic of a temporary pause being seen here, it's not just the Iranians who will be hoping for a pause. Israel will also be licking its wounds, which, as we saw via many videos on social media during this conflict, were physical, but we also saw financial damage, with the war costing them more than $1 billion a day. This temporary pause is unfolding before our eyes right now, and will continue to unfold for as long as the ceasefire holds. The fact that this is happening implies that both Iran and Israel seem set for at least a short period of recovery. Moving on, there is the scenario that this is still a batch of geopolitical theatre. A huge fact that is supporting this potential scenario is that nobody knows what the terms of the ceasefire are, because we've not been told. There is no roadmap here with a ceasefire, and all we know is that talks are expected between the United States and Iran. As I've said above multiple times, I believe that successful talks are unlikely, but if we remain in a period of geopolitical theatre, this makes attempting to explore future scenarios a lot more difficult, because we don't know what calls those in charge are potentially making. If this is the case, and we're still in a period of geopolitical theatre, it is worth questioning why would Iran play along at the negotiating table. They would have to be incentivized to do so, and this would likely come through sanctions relief that could see them improve the status of their economic and energy crises that they're currently experiencing. In return, the United States would likely want an element of control in Iran's nuclear enrichment, which would also bring the differences between the US and Iran in potential levels of nuclear enrichment to the table once again. So if we are still in a period of geopolitical theatre, the question will be, when does the performance end? This could come to a head on the topic of nuclear enrichment, but time will tell here, especially with a potential meeting set between the United States and Iran over the weekend. Another scenario surrounding the war between Israel and Iran is that this war restarts. The timing of this will likely depend on the status of Iran's nuclear industry and if it once again seeks to expand its ambitions. This potential for a war restarting will also depend on Netanyahu's political survival, and it will depend on the speed of Iran and Israel's recoveries. If the stars align for Netanyahu once again, as they did a few weeks ago, and if Iran makes it obvious that it's looking to expand its nuclear ambitions, then Israel sees this as existential. However, As I've noted, this war did also hurt them, so they will be looking to recover for now. But what could occur in a few months' time when they've had time to recover? We saw escalation and an eventual pause occur in both April 2024 and October 2024. But the events of June 2025 escalated beyond anything that we've seen prior. This issue is existential for Israel, but it is also existential for Iran, who could now be on a pathway to pursuing a potential deterrent against any nation who wants to be aggressive towards it. This, in my opinion, keeps Israel and Iran set on a collision course, and without a nuclear deal, it will remain that way. This sees Israel and Iran remain on a collision course, and the only way that this potential collision course could be diverted is either through a nuclear deal, through the confirmed destruction of Iran's nuclear industry, or through regime change. Two of these, that being the confirmed destruction of Iran's nuclear industry and the potential for regime change in Iran, would likely involve the war restarting. And as I've already discussed multiple times, I don't believe a nuclear deal is likely. Finally, we move on to the scenario of the potential for Iranian regime change as a part of the war between Iran and Israel. In the aftermath of this recent conflict that we've seen over the last few weeks, Netanyahu stated that if there had been an assessment that the Iranian regime could fall, that he would have continued the attacks. The Israeli Defense Minister also confirmed this yesterday, when he stated that if the Israelis knew where Khamenei was, that they would have tried to take him out. So it's clear that the Israelis see this as important, but it's also clear that they didn't have the capabilities to achieve regime change within Iran. This likely implies that an external forced Iranian collapse is very unlikely, especially now during this period of pause. This led me to question if an external forced collapse wouldn't be possible. Would an internal Iranian collapse be possible? We have seen the Iranian people celebrating in the streets of Tehran, and although this could be a visual ploy, judging the reality on the ground in Iran is difficult. Many will remember the protests in 2022 and the death of Mahsa Amini, but again, judging overall sentiment in Iran without being there is very difficult. If this scenario did occur, at any time in the future, a power vacuum could emerge. Especially in the Middle East, this is never really a good thing. And there are many nations that would take an interest here. The Israelis and the Americans most definitely would. But also Russia, China, neighbouring countries such as Pakistan and Azerbaijan, and the Saudis would also take an interest. There are also non-state actors in the area, such as the Kurdish population, who for a long time have been hoping for their own homeland. So of course, the Iranian people have been subjected to the regime's aggressive policies for decades. But if such a collapse did occur, it might not all be good news. So the final batch of scenarios that I want to explore is on an individual level. Where does Israel go from here? We've largely been focusing on Iran through its nuclear industry scenarios and the potential for this war to spark once again. But as we are sitting in this temporary pause, where could the Israelis go from here? Part of the discussion on Iran, I've already discussed the scenario that Israel will take a pause and a period to rebuild, but then the war with Iran will restart. But there are also a few other scenarios that I believe are worth exploring. Firstly, I think it's likely that we see Israel return to its other wars, primarily because they already have. Since this ceasefire, we've seen Israel once again increase its attacks against Gaza. We've also seen them launch airstrikes against Lebanon, killing the head of a currency exchange company, who the Israel Defense Forces said transferred funds from Iran to Hezbollah. We've also seen the Houthi rebels out of Yemen vowing to increase attacks on the Red Sea and against Israel once again, which could see Israel also target the Houthis in response. Israel also remains active in Syria, having built a buffer zone that gives them a view over Syria from Mount Hermon, and they also launched airstrikes on Damascus on Tuesday evening. So, just as Netanyahu started war with Iran to remain in power and to appease his coalition, the other wars in the region will remain active, so Netanyahu can still have his war that allows him to remain in power. On the flip side of this, there is the potential scenario that we see peace. This is a scenario, in my opinion, that is low probability, based on the fact that Netanyahu clearly wants to see his own political career survive, because he is incentivized to personally, so he doesn't have to face his corruption trial. We even saw Donald Trump acknowledge this in the last few days, as he posted on Truth Social saying that Netanyahu should be given a pardon and that this trial should be dropped. If peace is to occur, especially in Gaza, then there could be a Trump-Abraham Accords related pursuit that leads to peace. There has been reports that this is a potential scenario that we could see unfold, and that peace in Gaza will occur in the next 2 weeks. We have seen this before, and it hasn't come to fruition. But such a deal would involve other countries, especially the UAE and Egypt, supporting in rebuilding the Strip, and it would see the relocation of Palestinians to the countries who offer to help. Hamas would also be removed from power and exiled as a part of such a deal, but as the last few years have determined, they seem heavily embedded within the Gaza Strip, so achieving such a policy could prove very difficult. Also, if such a peace was to occur, the Palestinians would have to be allowed to forge their own future, likely under the Palestinian Authority that has recently been reformed. It is questionable if this would occur, especially with the reports that the Palestinians could potentially be moved to the nations who offer to aid in rebuilding the Strip. If peace did occur in Gaza, then an Abraham Accords expansion between Saudi Arabia and Israel would likely be pursued. The Saudis have previously stated that a normalization of relations with the Israelis would be conditional on peace in Gaza and Palestinian statehood. If this occurred, then the Saudis are seen as a huge player in the Middle East, and this could end up starting a chain reaction that sees normalization between Israel and other states in the Middle East. This would also likely be a bucket list item for Trump. So, to conclude what is going to be a rather long episode, these scenarios aren't mutually exclusive. Many of them could unfold at the same time. My current base case, based on what we've discussed in this episode, is that no deal is signed and that Iran will accelerate its nuclear ambitions. We are already seeing this via the parliamentary vote, which suspended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, but this will become clearer over the coming days and weeks. I still believe that both Iran and Israel will want to pause and recover for a period, but the deeper issues here that lead to both of these countries clashing with each other remain. As a part of this recovery, Israel will return to its other wars in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. Trump will hope for a larger Abraham Accords deal, as we have seen in the news over the last few days. But Netanyahu needs a war to not have to face his personal corruption trial. This leads me to believe that war in some form will remain. If peace occurs in Gaza, Israel could once again look towards Iran. Eventually, if we remain in this pause period for quite some time, news of Iran's nuclear progress will once again enter the news flow. Since this is an existential risk for Israel, they can't allow this. And Iran possessing nuclear weapons, as I've stated many times, would act as a form of deterrent for the survival of the regime. Because these two pursuits can't coexist, this would likely lead to the war restarting. Next time, if this war does reignite, the goals would be similar. The Israelis would hope to crush Iran's nuclear industry, but with the US arsenal of bunker buster bombs heavily depleted, they could struggle to do this. If this was a pursuit that was undertaken, this would once again mean direct US involvement in war with Iran. But if Iran's nuclear ambitions were visibly advancing, which we could see again through the suspension of cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or with Iran potentially withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If this did occur, then the United States would likely get involved in the war anyway. There is also the potential that news about Iran's potential secret new enrichment facility is revealed over the coming months. If this was the case, then this would add another element to the story of Iran and its nuclear ambitions. Also, next time, if this war does erupt once again, regime change will once again emerge as a goal of the Israelis and the United States. There is a nuance that I want to note on this front. I've stated that, as we saw in this most recent conflict, the Israelis clearly struggled to achieve this, and so that's why the conflict has stopped. They realised that this goal was one that they were very unlikely to achieve. However, Iran will inevitably one day be in a position where a new leader is needed, and how this conflict and Khamenei's departure line up in Iran's future could very much determine the direction that the country takes. Much remains up in the air in the Middle East and in this conflict between Israel and Iran, but one thing is clear: this is far from over. Before I end today's episode, I want to thank the new subscribers and new followers that I've received over the last few weeks while I've been discussing this conflict between Israel and Iran. It's great to have you on board. I post twice a week over on Substack on Mondays and Thursdays. These blogs are then released as podcast episodes in which I provide deeper details behind the stories that I'm discussing. Next time, if no tensions emerge in the Middle East once again, I will move back to discussing the European Union and whether the European Union can become a superpower in its own right, or if they are destined to be a middleman in the superpower conflict between the United States and China. Until then, I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.